The Curse of Ravenwood Cemetery. Ravenwood Cemetery had always been a place of dark legend in the small town of Ashwood. The crumbling headstones and rusty iron gates seemed to whisper tales of the dead who lay within. For as long as anyone could remember, the townsfolk had avoided the cemetery, fearful of the evil spirits that lurked among the shadows. But one person was not afraid. 17-year-old Jake, the Snake, Stevens. Jake was a teenage rebel, always looking for the next thrill and never backing down from a challenge. He had grown up hearing the ghost stories and urban legends about Ravenwood Cemetery, and he didn't believe a word of them. One dark and stormy night, Jake decided to explore the cemetery for himself. He snuck out of his bedroom window and made his way to the cemetery gates, laughing to himself as he pushed them open with a creak. As he walked deeper into the cemetery, the wind howling through the trees and the rain pounding against his face, Jake felt a thrill of excitement. This was it, the ultimate adventure. He was going to explore the depths of Ravenwood Cemetery and prove to himself and everyone else that it was just a bunch of old bones and dust. But as he turned a corner, Jake stumbled upon a grave that made his blood run cold. It was an old, weathered headstone with a name and date that seemed to leap out at him. Emily Wilson, died 1850. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine as he read the name. There was something about it that seemed familiar, something that tugged at his memory. And then, as he looked closer, he saw it. A small, rusty locket buried in the dirt at the base of the headstone. Jake's heart was racing as he picked up the locket and opened it. Inside, he found a faded photograph of a young girl with a hauntingly beautiful face. It was Emily Wilson, the girl who had died in 1850. As Jake looked at the photograph, he felt a strange sensation wash over him. It was as if he had been transported back in time, to the era when Emily Wilson was alive. He saw her walking through the cemetery, her eyes fixed on him with a mournful gaze. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision was over. Jake was left standing alone in the cemetery, the locket still clutched in his hand. He felt shaken and confused, unsure of what had just happened. But as he turned to leave, Jake heard a faint whispering in his ear. It was a soft, melancholy voice, and it seemed to be calling to him. "Jake," the voice whispered, "come back and visit me again soon." Jake spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to be coming from all around him, echoing off the headstones and trees. And then, as he stood there frozen with fear, Jake saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a girl with a white dress and a face that was deathly pale. She was walking towards him, her eyes fixed on his with a mournful gaze. Jake tried to run, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. The girl drew closer and closer, until he could see the sadness in her eyes. "Who are you?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "I am Emily Wilson," the girl replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you, Jake Stevens, are a trespasser in my domain." As Jake watched in horror, Emily's face began to change. Her eyes turned black as coal, and her skin grew even paler. She reached out a hand and touched Jake's face, and he felt a chill run down his spine. "You should not have come here," Emily whispered, her breath cold against Jake's ear. "Now you will never leave." And with that, everything went black. When Jake came to, he was lying on the ground, his head throbbing with pain. The storm had passed, and the sun was shining down on him. He sat up, rubbing his head, and looked around. He was alone in the cemetery. There was no sign of Emily Wilson, or the ghostly apparition that had spoken to him. Jake stumbled to his feet, wondering if it had all been just a wild imagination. But as he looked down at the locket still clutched in his hand, Jake knew that it had been real. He had uncovered a dark secret in Ravenwood Cemetery, and now he was being drawn back into its clutches. Over the next few days, Jake found himself becoming increasingly obsessed with Emily Wilson and the mysterious locket. He spent every spare moment researching the history of the cemetery and the family that had once lived there. And then, one night, Jake received a mysterious package in the mail. Inside, he found a small, leather-bound book with a note attached to it. The note read, "Meet me at Ravenwood Cemetery at midnight if you want to learn the truth about Emily Wilson." Jake's heart was racing as he read the note. Who could have sent this? And what did they want from him? Despite his reservations, Jake found himself drawn to the mystery. He decided to go to the cemetery at midnight, hoping to uncover the truth about Emily Wilson and the strange occurrences that had been happening. As the clock struck midnight, Jake made his way to the cemetery. The moon was full overhead, casting an eerie glow over the gravestones. Jake walked through the gates, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman with long, curly hair and a white dress that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. "Welcome, Jake," she said, her voice low and husky. "I've been waiting for you." Jake's eyes widened as he realized who the woman was. It was Emily Wilson, the ghostly apparition he had seen in the cemetery before. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I want to tell you my story," Emily replied, her eyes gleaming with a mischievous light. "A story of love, loss, and betrayal. A story that has been hidden for centuries." As Emily began to speak, Jake felt himself being drawn into a world of horror and suspense. He listened, entranced, as Emily told him the dark secrets of Ravenwood Cemetery. But as the night wore on, Jake began to realize that he was trapped. Emily's story was not just a simple tale of ghostly apparitions and unrequited love. It was a web of deceit and betrayal that went far beyond the grave. And Jake was caught right in the middle of it. "Emily, what's going on?" Jake asked, his voice shaking with fear. "You'll find out soon enough," Emily replied, her eyes glinting with a malevolent light. "But for now, let's just say that you're a part of my story now, and there's no escape." As Emily's words echoed through the cemetery, Jake knew that he was in grave danger. He had to get out of there, and fast. But as he turned to run, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. "You're not going anywhere, Jake," Emily whispered, her breath cold against his ear. "You're going to stay right here with me, forever." And with that, everything went black. When Jake came to, he was lying in his own bed, his head throbbing with pain. It was morning, and the sun was shining through the window. But as he sat up and looked around, Jake realized that something was terribly wrong. His room was different, the furniture rearranged, and on his nightstand, there was a small, leather-bound book with a note attached to it. The note read, "Welcome to your new life, Jake. You'll be staying here with me forever." As Jake's eyes widened in horror, he realized that he was trapped in a living nightmare. Emily Wilson's curse had followed him home, and now he was a prisoner in his own house. And there was no escape. My 30-day experiment with a scary phone call changed everything. It all started with a simple challenge, a dare. Really? My friend Dylan, always the skeptic, had dared me to take part in something strange and, in his words, ridiculously harmless. A 30-day experiment. He said it would be a test of courage, a simple game to push the limits of what we believed was real. He said that at the end of it, I would laugh about how ridiculous it all was. But Dylan didn't know what I would encounter. None of us could have predicted the nightmare that would begin with a phone call, the kind of thing that would ruin my life in ways I never thought possible. The premise of the experiment seemed innocent enough. For 30 days, every night at exactly 3 a.m., I was to receive an unknown phone call. I would answer, say nothing, and listen. That was the whole deal. Dylan had found the game on some obscure corner of the internet, and according to the rules, every night the call would get progressively weirder. At first, it would be just silence. Then, whispers. Then, voices, distorted and incomprehensible. And by the end of the 30 days, the game, would climax with a revelation of sorts, though no one was sure what it would be. Dylan claimed it would be a joke, just an internet prank meant to mess with people's heads. Of course, I didn't believe him. What harm could a phone call do? Besides, who could be calling me at 3 a.m. every night? The first night passed without incident. At 3 a.m., my phone rang, just an unknown number flashing on the screen. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen, then answered it. There was nothing but static on the other end. I held the phone to my ear for what felt like an eternity, but there was no sound, no voice, not even a breath. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off. Dylan had warned me it would start slow, so I waited for the game to escalate. Night 2 came, and so did the call. This time, I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn I heard something faint in the background, a whisper. It was so soft, so distant. It was as though the voice was coming from miles away, or maybe from within the walls themselves. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone, the tone. It felt like someone was calling out for help, or worse, someone trapped. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath becoming shallow as the whisper seemed to get closer. Then, just as quickly, it stopped. The call ended without warning, and I sat in stunned silence, my heart pounding in my chest. I called Dylan the next day, laughing it off. "This is stupid," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. But that night, the call came again, and the whispers grew more distinct. This time, I could almost hear the words, almost. "Help me," it sounded like, but the voice was distorted, twisted in a way that felt wrong. My mind raced as I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was terribly off. The days wore on, and the calls became worse. The whispers turned to full sentences, but they were garbled, distorted beyond recognition. One night, I could hear a woman's voice, high-pitched, desperate. She was pleading, begging me for something, but I couldn't understand her words. The sense of dread grew heavier each night, until I felt paralyzed, unable to sleep. What terrified me more than anything was that the voice sounded like someone who knew me, someone who knew my deepest fears, my darkest thoughts, my weaknesses. It started to feel like whoever was on the other end was watching me, studying me, learning my every move. On night 15, everything changed. The phone rang, and for the first time, the voice was clear, too clear. A man's voice, low and raspy, filled the line. "You're not alone," he said, his voice chilling. "We're inside. We're always inside." My blood turned to ice, and my stomach dropped. I knew instantly that this wasn't some prank. This wasn't a game. There was something malicious, something insidious behind the call. I felt it, the presence, the weight of it, suffocating me. I hung up, my hands trembling. I looked around the room. The shadows in the corners of the walls seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally, as though something was crawling out of the darkness. But it didn't stop there. The phone calls continued, each one more terrifying than the last. The voice grew louder, more aggressive, more familiar. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to break. I didn't tell anyone about what was happening. I didn't want to seem weak, but the toll it was taking on me was undeniable. I began to lose track of time. The days bled into each other, and the calls kept coming, the voices growing more intense, more desperate. By the time the 25th night arrived, I was barely holding on. The voice on the phone sounded like it was right next to me, like it was breathing in my ear. It said my name, and I froze in terror. The way it said my name, wrong, distorted, was enough to make my skin crawl. "We're coming for you. We're inside your mind," it whispered. "We know you. We're part of you." I tried to stop it. I tried to block the number, but it was useless. The calls kept coming, at all hours, every time, and they weren't just on the phone. At night, I'd hear footsteps outside my door. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that something was lurking just beyond my sight. I'd find things moved around in my apartment, things that hadn't been there before. Small, insignificant things, but enough to make my pulse race with dread. The last night of the experiment arrived, and I had no idea what to expect. I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, my mind unraveling from the terror that had consumed me. The phone rang at 3 a.m., as it always did, but this time, there was no whisper. There was no distorted voice. There was just a silence. Then, a soft, almost pleasant voice. "It's over now. You passed the test." I stared at the phone in disbelief. My heart was pounding, but there was no release, no relief. I hung up, feeling empty, as if something was missing, something I could never get back. The experiment was over, but I wasn't free. In the days that followed, the fear didn't dissipate. If anything, it festered, growing deeper, more pervasive, until I could feel it in every crevice of my life. I would go about my day, but there was always this underlying tension, a gnawing feeling that I couldn't escape. It wasn't the phone calls anymore. It was something far worse, something more real, more suffocating. The calls didn't stop, not even after the experiment ended. At 3 a.m., without fail, my phone would ring, the same unknown number flashing on the screen. I could hear the ringing echo in my ears long before it started, a warning, a drumbeat in my head that I couldn't shut out. But it wasn't just the phone calls anymore that terrified me. No, it was the way the calls seemed to stretch beyond the confines of the phone itself. It was as though they were invading every part of my life. My thoughts, my movements, my breath. It became an inescapable presence, something inside me, gnawing and clawing at the edges of my mind. I began to hear things, faint at first, barely noticeable. Footsteps in the hall when I knew I was alone. The faintest whispers when the wind blew through the cracks in the window. But the worst of it came at night. It started slowly, just a rustling sound, like paper being crumpled, coming from the corners of the room. I would sit up in bed, listening, heart hammering in my chest. But there was nothing there when I turned on the lights. I thought I was losing my mind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. On the 10th night after the experiment, the real terror began. I woke to a coldness in the air, unusual, unnatural. I glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. The phone rang. I sat frozen, staring at it, paralyzed by the fear of what would come next. I had blocked the number, yet there it was again, flashing on the screen. I couldn't bring myself to answer it, but I couldn't stop myself from watching it ring. Then, as if answering the question I dared not ask, the whispers began, creeping out of the phone like smoke. But these weren't the usual distorted voices I had grown accustomed to. No, these were words, clear, sharp, full of venom. "We're in your house." The voice was cold and human, as though it wasn't just speaking to me, but through me. "We've been here all along." I couldn't breathe. I felt the walls of my room closing in on me, as though the very air was suffocating, squeezing the life out of me. I scrambled to hang up the phone, my hands trembling so violently that I nearly dropped it. But when I did, the voice didn't stop. It lingered in the air, thick and oppressive, almost like it was hovering just over my shoulder. A subtle pressure, a feeling that something was right there, so close, but just out of reach. The next day, I found myself standing in the hallway of my apartment, unable to move. I was paralyzed with fear. There, on the floor in front of me, was a small, blackened handprint, as if something had pressed its palm against the wood. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, it was gone, vanished, like it had never been there. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out, but I couldn't. It was like the walls had trapped me, like the house itself had become a prison. Then, it began to follow me. I could hear it in the background, the whispers, the barely audible sounds. I thought I was imagining it, but no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the sounds followed. In the grocery store, I heard it faintly, just on the edge of hearing, like someone muttering behind me. In the library, I thought I saw shadows flickering at the corners of my vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. And then came the worst night of all. The phone rang at exactly 3 a.m., as it always did, but this time, When I picked it up, I wasn't greeted by the usual whispers. Instead, there was a laugh, low, guttural, a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just any laugh. It was mine, my laugh, but twisted, warped, as though it was mocking me. I stumbled back, the phone slipping from my grip, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. The laughter didn't stop. It echoed in the room, filling every corner, bouncing off the walls until it was all I could hear. I tried to move, to get away, but my feet were glued to the floor, my body frozen, as if something was holding me in place. The laughter grew louder, more sinister, until it was inside my head. My pulse pounded in my ears. I could feel the walls pressing in on me again, suffocating me, and that's when I realized it wasn't a game anymore. Whatever had been on the other end of the phone, whatever I had invited into my life, was no longer a voice. It was something that lived inside the walls, something that was becoming me. I screamed, but the voice inside my head, my voice, laughed louder, and I could feel my mind unraveling. My own thoughts betrayed me, whispering things that weren't mine, thoughts I couldn't control, whispers of things I had never known. "We're inside you," it said. "We are you." And for the first time, I understood. It wasn't just about the calls. The calls were the beginning, the opening of a door I should never have opened. Now, there was no escape. Whatever was behind the calls had crossed over, had become part of me. I didn't dare answer the phone after that night. I couldn't. But the calls kept coming, every night at 3 a.m. And every time I saw the unknown number, I couldn't stop my heart from racing. I didn't know what would happen when I answered, but I knew it wouldn't stop until it had completely consumed me. I'm telling you this now because I don't know how much longer I can fight it. The calls are more than just a game. They've become my nightmare. And the worst part? I'm not sure if I'm still me. I'm not sure if I ever was. I only know one thing now. It's still out there, and it's waiting. The phone call from the dead. Sarah sat in her dimly lit living room, curled up on the couch. The soft glow of a candle flickered beside her, casting long shadows on the walls. It had been 2 weeks since her father, James, passed away. The grief was still raw, gnawing at her heart with each passing day. Her eyes were heavy, tears threatening to spill as she stared at his old picture frame resting on the coffee table. His smile was comforting, but it only made her ache more. The silence in the room was interrupted by the sudden, jarring sound of her phone vibrating. Sarah hesitated. She glanced at the screen, and her heart froze in her chest. The caller ID showed only one name, Dad. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone, her mind racing. This can't be real. She stared at the screen in disbelief. Her father's phone number was calling her. Her breath caught in her throat. He was gone. She had seen him buried, heard the dirt thud against his coffin. Without thinking, Sarah answered the call. "Hello?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, she heard a faint rustling on the other end. It sounded like someone trying to clear their throat. Her heart raced, and she squeezed her eyes shut. Then, the voice came through. His voice, but it was distorted, like static through a broken speaker. "Sarah?" The voice sounded strained, but it was unmistakably her father's. "Dad!" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Is it really you?" There was a long pause. She could hear something in the background, whispers, or was it wind? The voice on the phone came again, now slower, more deliberate. I'm here, sweetheart. I didn't want to leave you. Sarah's blood ran cold. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was too familiar, too much like him. But there was an edge to it. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. Dad, where are you? How is this even happening? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. She felt a growing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. Something about the call was wrong. It wasn't the same. The voice on the other end chuckled softly, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't the warm, comforting laugh she remembered. It was too low, too hollow. I'm right here, Sarah, the voice whispered. You don't need to worry about me. I never left. Sarah's fingers began to shake uncontrollably. She stood up and walked to the window, peering outside into the dark street. It was empty, but the house felt heavier now. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, stretching toward her. She looked back at her phone, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Dad, please, this isn't funny. She stopped mid-sentence. The voice was no longer her father's. It was something deeper, something darker, something that didn't belong. I'm not your father, the voice growled, sending a chill down her spine. It was low, guttural, like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. But I know everything about you, Sarah. Her body stiffened. What do you want from me? She whispered, her throat dry. She could hear the breathing on the other end, heavy and labored, like something was standing right behind her. The hairs on her neck prickled. You should have never answered the call, Sarah, the voice whispered. You belong to me now. Sarah's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move. She dropped the phone onto the couch, her eyes wide with fear. The voice on the other end continued, growing louder and more distorted, now mixing with faint whispers that sounded like they were coming from inside the walls. Her hands scrambled to grab the phone, but it slipped from her grasp. The room felt cold, the air thick with something she couldn't see, but it was suffocating, pressing against her chest. She backed up slowly toward the door, her breathing quick and shallow. Suddenly, the phone rang again. This time, the screen showed her father's number once more. She nearly jumped out of her skin, panic rising in her chest. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. Something was here now, in the house with her. Don't answer it, she muttered to herself, shaking her head as she backed into the corner. But the phone kept ringing. The whispers grew louder, now clearer. They were behind her. Against every instinct, Sarah grabbed the phone. Dad, she said, her voice trembling. But the moment she said his name, the voice on the other end didn't reply in words. Instead, a horrible, distorted laugh rang through the phone, deep and chilling. The laugh echoed in the walls around her, amplifying until it was all she could hear. I warned you, Sarah, the voice hissed. You can't escape me. She slammed the phone down, but it kept ringing, the same number, the same voice, louder. And then, in the silence that followed, she heard something else, footsteps, slow, dragging steps. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she turned around, her eyes searching the dark corners of the room. The shadows shifted, moving in ways they shouldn't. The temperature in the room plummeted, her breath visible in the air as she backed up into the corner. It's here, she thought, her stomach twisting. The footsteps were louder now, approaching her. But when she turned to the doorway, she saw nothing. There was no one. Her breath hitched in her throat as the hairs on her arms stood on end. She heard the phone ringing again. This time, it was coming from somewhere else, deeper in the house, coming from the kitchen. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her eyes darted from the phone, back to the doorway, and then to the shadows in the hallway. The air grew thick with an unnatural force, as if the house itself was alive, watching her. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone one last time, holding it to her ear, her body frozen in terror. The voice, now unmistakably dark and malevolent, spoke again. "You should have never answered the phone, Sarah. You invited me back, and now I am coming for you." Suddenly, the phone call cut off. The room fell into an eerie silence. Sarah stood still, the phone still pressed to her ear, the weight of the words echoing in her mind. But the silence didn't last long. From the other side of the room, Sarah saw it. A shadow, dark and distorted, moving in the corner. And then, the phone began to ring again, this time with a terrifying sound. It wasn't a ring anymore. It was a scream, a horrible, screeching wail, as if someone, or something, was calling out in agony. The figure in the corner of the room stepped forward, and Sarah's blood ran cold. The shape was no longer human. It was her father's face, but not his face, contorted, eyes black and hollow, smiling as it reached out toward her. Her body screamed to run, but she couldn't. Her legs wouldn't move. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The phone continued to scream in her ear, a relentless, unearthly noise, as the figure closed in. In the final moment, before everything went black, she heard one last whisper, so close it made her skin crawl. "You answered, and now you're mine." The screen goes dark,